Okay, welcome everyone to another installment of our Lunch and Learn webinar series. Even though we have a lot of friends joining us from the West Coast who are having breakfast right now. A few housekeeping items. Please put your phones on mute. I can already hear some folks' background noise. So if you could please mute your phones and your computers during this presentation, that would be much appreciated. We're going to use this chat function up here for questions during the presentation, and if I can, I'll open it up after, and you can ask your questions directly, but please utilize that chat function. All right, somebody else still does not have their phone on mute. Sorry, I feel like the teacher, but you'll really want to not have any interruptions and hear what our speaker is going to be talking about today. We are recording this webinar, and we'll share the slide presentation and the recorded link with everyone afterwards. So thanks again for joining us. We're going to learn all about California's new regulations to divert organic materials from landfills and other initiatives to address climate change, as well as the role that biosolids can play in achieving California's goals. Our presenter today is Greg Kester. He's the Director of Renewable Resource Programs for the California Association of Sanitation Agencies. Greg serves as both a technical and programmatic contact for CASA members and the conduit for emerging issues on state and federal levels related to biosolids, renewable energy, recycled water, and related issues. He works closely with local, state, and federal authorities, as well as the private sector, on biosolids management, climate change mitigation, energy optimization, and basically all management options. He's the main conduit of information for emerging technologies and markets for biosolids management. If everyone could mute your phones, I'd really appreciate that, those of you logging on late. So interestingly, prior to joining CASA, Greg served as the State Biosolids Coordinator for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. He was elected by his peers to represent all the states in the nation to the U.S. EPA on biosolids issues. He served on the National Academy of Sciences Committee, which evaluated federal biosolids regulations, and produced the 2002 report called Biosolids Applied to Land, Advancing Standards and Practices. Greg has a BS in Civil Engineering from the University of Wisconsin, where he's also a registered professional engineer. And prior to earning his degree in engineering, Greg drove an 18-wheel tractor tanker for 10 years, delivering liquid biosolids to agricultural fields for land application through direct injection. So I think you would agree that Greg's experience gives him a holistic view of all sides of the biosolids program. And one more final reminder to mute your phones. I am very happy to introduce Greg Kester this morning to all of you. Let's go ahead, Greg.
Well, thank you very much, Janine, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to virtually see everyone, or at least know that you're there. Happy to have this opportunity to update you on some issues in California. We can begin. So there's a number of legislative initiatives that have taken place over the last number of years in California with the intent of mitigating climate change. Some of these include a requirement to produce 50% of our energy from renewable sources by 2026, 60% by 2030, and 100% by 2045. There was a goal adopted several years ago to recycle 75% of our solid waste by 2020. A big one was to emit 40% less carbon dioxide equivalent emissions by 2030 than were emitted in 1990. That's a big one. Also, a requirement to reduce our carbon intensity of transportation fuel, beginning 7.5% reduction by 2020, up to a 20% reduction by 2030. That's sort of a linear reduction per year. And then two that I'll talk about in a lot more detail are a requirement to reduce our short-lived climate pollutants, which for the wastewater sector really means methane. And we need to get a 40% methane reduction by 2030, using 2013 as a baseline. And then on a related note, back in 2015, then Governor Brown adopted a Healthy Soils Initiative intended really to ensure sustainable agriculture for future generations of Californians. And this plays into some of our efforts. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh. So there are a number of opportunities that are recognized both by the state and by the wastewater sector for collaborative opportunities in order to achieve the state mandates and goals. This includes the use of our existing infrastructure, which back in 2015, I estimated where we could accept at least 75% of the food waste that's currently being landfilled and accept that for anaerobic digestion. By so doing, we'll increase our biogas production and increase our renewable energy. And with that energy, we can produce our low carbon transportation fuel, produce a pipeline grade renewable natural gas, and at the same time decrease fossil fuel based greenhouse gas emissions. And then in line with that Healthy Soils initiatives, we can improve soil health, sequester carbon, reduce fossil fuel intense inorganic fertilizer use through the land application of biosolids. And all of this also demands that we develop collaborative partnerships with the private sector on the waste side. And I'll get into that in a little more detail as well. So we have about 150 wastewater plants in California that utilize anaerobic digestion. These are often located in urban areas near the point of generation for organic waste. There are some challenges, though, in order for us to effectively make use of that capacity and that infrastructure. As I mentioned earlier, we need to build partnerships with the solid waste sector where our universes haven't historically intersected. They will increasingly going into the future. And we've already begun the process of introducing ourselves to each other. We've held a series of about 5 meetings between the wastewater, solid waste, and regulatory sectors just to be able to understand these challenges and needs. We have to ensure that an organic waste stream that would be received needs to be clean to a level where it's not going to adversely affect our operations, whether that be for co-digestion, standalone digestion, or for compost. And another big need is to assure that we have markets in place for the use of that biogas and our biosolids that we're producing. Next slide. So we estimate that we can get a 30% or with a 30% volumetric increase in food waste, we can double the amount of biogas produced. Now that's obviously variable across agencies, but that's a general rule of thumb. And again, with this biogas production increase, again, there are some local challenges and needs. We have air districts in California that have imposed limitations on combustion emissions, especially in those air districts that are in severe non-attainment for ozone, like the South Coast, which is the Los Angeles Basin, or the San Joaquin Valley, which is essentially the Central Valley of California. Others have imposed limits on biogas volumes, and there are other restrictions as well. So these are challenges that we need to overcome. The Public Utilities Commission has heating and siloxane standards for pipeline injection. These have been revised in recent years so that the heating value needs now are much more achievable. Initially, they were $9.90. Now they're down to $9.70, which is much more achievable for our wastewater plants. Siloxanes remain an issue, though, because we still essentially have to have non-detect for siloxanes. The investor-owned utilities have evolved over the last several years. They initially really did not have an interest in wastewater biogas. They are much more accepting of it now, we think. However, costs and access issues are still an issue and are still a stumbling block to interconnection. We have an issue with US EPA and the Renewable Fuel Standard. Several years ago, they had a change in their interpretation of RIN values, which apply to wastewater plants when we co-digest in our digesters. I'll talk about that in more detail moving forward. Again, we need that market certainty to ensure that we have viable uses for that biogas. And then also in California, the Air Resources Board developed new calculators for our low carbon fuel standard credits. And I'll talk about that more moving forward as well. Again, other challenges with scaling up food waste acceptance, foremost is cost. There are capital expenses for those pre-processing needs. Most wastewater plants, even if they have the excess capacity in their digesters, there's still a need to improve receiving facilities or install them. There are some operational challenges with grit management and, again, increased solids handling as well. And, of course, there are some risks involved. While that pre-processing technology is evolving, it is still immature. So that's something which we see improving really on a pretty steady basis, but it is something to be aware of. And then, of course, handling organic waste is not a wastewater plant's core business. You know, we're really designed and tasked with handling water and biosolids and treating them and managing them effectively, not necessarily accepting organic waste and producing energy. In some parts of California, we have a lack of interested partners until regulations really are in place to mandate the diversion of organics. There has been some reticence in parts of the state to do alternative management options. And then in other parts of the state, we have competition for feedstock because it has gone successfully. And again, just highlighting again that uncertainty with markets for the products of digestion. Next slide. Several years ago, the California State Water Resources Control Board contracted with Carollo engineers to, we had done estimates back in about 2015 that I really made some assumptions in and did not overly well document and quantify. So the water boards wanted to have a more quantifiable estimate of excess capacity with our existing infrastructure. So they contracted with Carollo engineers to do that. And really the purpose here is well stated, and they really want to better coordinate and cost effectively maximize that organic waste diversion, improve and increase co-digestion, and ensure that there is beneficial uses for both biogas and biosolids. Next slide. And that report is now complete, and it is set to be released perhaps as we speak. We thought it would come out this week. Certainly we expect it next week. And what the report really looks at is an estimate and distribution of food waste produced in California, looking out to 2025 and 2030, so we can get a better handle on what has to actually be diverted and recycled. And then looking at what excess capacity we have and how much, and doing an assessment of our processes and looking at that without any rehab or modifications. And then also looking at what the investment and capacity needs are for the key processes so that we could really fully utilize our excess capacity. Looking at greenhouse gas emission reduction and how that could be benefited through co-digestion. And that includes, I believe, a look at biosolids as well. And then they do several case studies looking at small to medium-sized facilities as well as several large full-scale sites. And the small to medium-sized facilities they looked at, I believe, were Silicon Valley Clean Water and the city of Manteca. And then if you can advance the slide, Janine, the large ones they looked at, I believe, were East Bay Mud and LA County Sanitation Districts. Back up one. I just wanted you to, if we can back up one, yeah. And then there are a lot of appendices with really good detail that will help us in terms of decision making and whether or not infrastructure that is existent can actually be utilized for co-digestion. Now next slide, please. So just to go back to impacts of the short-lived climate pollutant legislation. As I say, this is called SB 1383. It was adopted in 2016, and it requires a 40% reduction in methane emissions by 2013. I mean, using 2013 as a baseline, and we have to achieve that by 2030. And in order to achieve that, the legislation also includes a requirement to divert 50% of our organics away from landfills by 2020 and a 75% diversion by 2025. And for that, they use 2014 as a baseline. So this will be the thrust of the talk today, and I'll get into that in a minute. But I also want to just point out again the Healthy Soils Initiative and how the two complement each other. Because biosolids really helps achieve every goal of the action plan that was developed to implement this initiative. And that plan was developed by the California Department of Food and Agriculture. They recognize biosolids sequesters carbon, it improves soil tilth, and reduces the need for irrigation, and we increase our crop yield. All big objectives of that initiative. And then also the advantage of biosolids is the reduction of fossil fuel intense inorganic fertilizer. It's estimated that almost a quarter of a gallon of fossil fuel is needed for every pound of inorganic nitrogen. So the SB 1383 regulatory process began really almost as soon as the ink was dried on the legislation. The informal process began in early 2017. We were able to proactively engage really from the onset. Cal Recycle is the name of the regulatory agency who is tasked with implementing this legislation and developing the rules. They really are our solid waste division of Cal EPA. So after several years of the informal process, during which the intent is to really address major issues, and then they began the formal rulemaking process in the beginning of 2019, at which point they had 1 year before they needed to submit a regulatory package to the Office of Administrative Law. So they had virtually 4 iterations of regulations that were open for public comment. Central to the regulatory development, they agreed and realized that the wastewater sector is critical to actually achieving the legislative mandates. And to that end, they were responsive to a lot of our comments and requests, not so much to others, and I'll talk about both. Most importantly, perhaps, is that they do include language to disallow restrictive or prohibitive local ordinances on biosolids land application. And I'll talk about this in the next few slides. They also included procurement requirements for the products of landfill diversion through both compost and beneficial uses of biogas. Now, the Office of Administrative Law did receive the package in January of 2020. However, they rejected it. The rejection was really more for clarifying reasons. There are no substantive changes that we expect. We expect the resubmittal of the package any day now. Certainly, it has to be done by the beginning of September. So we expect in the next week or two for that package to be resubmitted. They did go out with another round of public comments in April of this year and had a 30-day public comment period. We did not comment on those revisions, though, because they were really minor and did not affect the wastewater sector. So in terms of biosolids management in California, we don't yet have the data for 2019, but for 2018, we generated about 675,000 dry metric tons of biosolids. Of that, 71% was land applied. So it's somewhat of a myth that land application is in trouble in California. We did still use roughly 17% for landfills, but most of that was used as alternative daily cover. And in California, based on prior legislation, using biosolids for alternative daily cover was always considered a beneficial use. That has changed now with the new legislation and the regulations that will be adopted. It no longer will be considered a beneficial use and will, we expect, not continue as a very viable option. We had basically 4% of the biosolids were incinerated. In 2018, there were 2 incinerators. Currently, there is only one of those decommissioned in 2019. We have about 5 agencies in the state who utilize surface disposal for a small percentage of management. The city of Los Angeles does deep well injection at their Terminal Island plant, where they inject liquid biosolids into depleted oil reserve caverns under the sea with the intent of ultimately extracting methane for beneficial use and also sequestering carbon dioxide. And then we have some biosolids that were in either storage or long-term treatment. Next slide. So this is a map of California currently, which shows the local ordinance impacts. The red counties have an all-out ban on land application. There used to be 2 additional counties that were red. Kern County, sort of just above Los Angeles County there, if you can see it, and Imperial County down along the Mexico and Arizona borders. They were both challenged in court and both overturned. So now they have lifted that ban. There are some that still have bans on Class B, and then those are shown in sort of the brownish color. And then the ones in pink have a conditional use permit requirement. And those conditional use permits really can be variable. Some of them amount to practical bans. Others are really very easy to get. So it's a wide spectrum of impacts that those counties employ. The green ones, which are fairly few in number and all in the north, allow Class B land application. And then the blue ones do not have any regulations or ordinance enacted, and they defer to the state and the U.S. EPA. The next slide. So with the regulations as currently adopted, which will become effective in January of 2022, this is what the state ought to look like. Class B and Class A biosolids application is allowed throughout the state. There is work that has to be done in order to make this a reality. And as soon as the regulations are adopted, we will begin negotiating and talking with counties to ensure that this, in fact, is what the state looks like. Next slide. So what we had recommended and what the Cal Recycle did in the regulation was essentially defer to the State Water Board's general order for land applied biosolids in lieu of those ordinances. That made us really examine the general order again in more detail, and we have recommended that the water boards make several revisions to it, which they have been open to. And so some of those revisions that are really important are that the general order currently allows more restrictive local ordinances. So we want to obviously delete that ability because that would be in direct conflict with what the state regulations would now allow. They also have differences with cumulative pollutant loading rates that conflict with the federal regulations and Part 503. They require background soil sampling and inclusion of those concentrations when calculating cumulative loading rates. They also have longer waiting periods before animals can graze on pasture land. We want that to be consistent with 503 as well. And then the general order also in some cases applies to exceptional quality products, which they recognized at the time that it was adopted in 2004 may not be necessary. We think after 16 years that can be revisited and no longer needed. So the water boards have said that they are open to revising the general order. They unfortunately, though, with the pandemic especially, are short-staffed and have several other general orders that also need revisions. So we're in the queue, but not sure as to where exactly at this point. So again, with the 1383 regulatory process, once they are adopted, which we still expect will happen in the fourth quarter of this year, the regulations will, none of the dates change at all, even though the adoption of the rule has been delayed. So the regulations will become effective in January of 2022. The state will begin able to enforce at that point. They have already voiced in writing that they intend to use a lot of enforcement discretion and will work proactively with jurisdictions to make sure that they understand what the requirements are and get them into compliance rather than taking strict enforcement action. Local jurisdictions will be able to enforce beginning January 1, 2024, and then compliance is required in January of 2025, compliance with the diversion requirements. There was a report on the progress that the state has made in meeting the mandates for organics diversion. This week it was released. There is going to be a webinar held by CalRecycle next week on August 25th. If anybody wants registration information or links to that report, I have sent them out in California to our Biosolids listserv, but happy to share those links as well. CalRecycle will also be releasing model ordinances that jurisdictions can adopt in order to ensure organics collection from generators in their service areas and that they can be recycled. Next slide. There are several issues that remain with the regulations that we were unsuccessful in arguing for. And one of the things that is unfortunate is that comments are, they've been submitted each of the public comment periods, and we submitted comments on each of those except for the last one. But none of our comments were responded to yet, so we don't know the reasons where comments were not acted on. And we won't see that until the final regulatory package is adopted. At that point, there will be responses to all comments that were received. So that will hopefully be illuminating, but it'll be too late, unfortunately, to take action. One of the important things that's not an issue, but it is something, well, it is a bit of an issue, but to be aware of is that there is nothing in the regulations that will compel any agency to change its management option for biosolids. But if they are utilizing landfills, if they are utilizing other process options, then it will all be considered landfill disposal. This is really illuminated in the bolded bullet here. So in order for biosolids to be considered as diverted from landfills, they need to be anaerobically digested and or composted and land applied. Anything else will be considered as landfill disposal. So if you aerobically digest and don't compost, or if you heat dry without digestion, or if you use surface disposal, you incinerate, any other treatment option, then don't land apply, you wind up being considered as disposed in a landfill. So this is something we had argued against, but were unsuccessful. So again, so each jurisdiction that has to divert organic waste has to procure a product of that diversion. So this was something that CalRecycle, I think, was trying to address one of the comments that we had made in terms of needing market assurance. And they helped in some respects and didn't in others. So they assume that each resident in a jurisdiction generates 0.08 tons of organic waste a year. And that's the factor that is then multiplied by the number of residents to get the amount of product which has to be procured as for diversion. So eligible procurement products include compost, including biosolids compost, and all beneficial uses of biogas. And these may be used on site, they may be purchased, or they may be required by a contract. For instance, if you have a long distance biosolids hauler, you could require that they use renewable natural gas from your digesters or other RNG. Financial transaction is not required. It could just be your own use. However, there are some issues. Next slide. So we had argued that all biosolids suitable for land application ought to be eligible as a procurement product. We were unsuccessful in that argument, however, because they only allow compost to be eligible. There's also then on-site power, heat, export of electricity, production, transportation fuel are all eligible uses of biogas. However, you do have to co-digest with diverted organic waste and not send more than 25% of your biosolids to a landfill. That's because the legislation requires 75% diversion, so they obviously need to comply with that. However, only the portion of gas which is produced from that diverted waste is eligible. So the sewage sludge produced biogas that you would be producing normally and actually increase through co-digestion is ineligible as a procurement product. The other issue is that all feedstock has to come from a landfill or a transfer station. So this excludes organic waste that you might receive directly from grocery stores, restaurants, institutions, and many other sources. Next slide. So that's sort of the capsulated summary of 1383 in our organics diversion law. Some other issues that we have with biogas use, however, also have come to bear. One of those is the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard Program with their Renewable Identification Number. They assign the highest value credit, RIN, to sewage sludge digestion. This is kind of the flip side of what California is doing. So if you are producing a transportation fuel from your biogas produced from your sludge digestion, you get the highest value credit for it from EPA. However, if you introduce organic waste directly into your digester for co-digestion, you get devalued to what's called, a advanced biomass RIN, which is only generally in the 10 to 25% value range of what a D3 RIN is, which you would get from your sludge-only digestion. So we have met with EPA officials a number of times in DC, trying to get a reinterpretation. We have brought in the Office of Science and Technology, the Office of Land and Emergency Management, NACWA, Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts, East Bay Mud, DC Water, and others have joined in these discussions. In 2019, the meeting was with the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation, who oversees the Renewable Fuel Standard Program. We thought that the meeting was productive. However, next slide. Next slide, yeah. And in that meeting, really it was, I viewed it as educating the Assistant Administrator. We were arguing that food waste is an integral part of sewage sludge. We're already receiving it through the sewage system at the headworks. And by treating it through your activated sludge system, you're really losing about 40% of the energy embedded in it. So it's much more efficient and effective to introduce it directly into the digester. So as a result of that, we're requesting that all biogas produced from our anaerobic digestion, whether it be through the headworks and sewage system or through hauled in and directly injected into the digester, that it should all be awarded a D3 RIN. However, we were denied and we received a letter declining that request. Next slide. So the other EPA offices were not consulted before that letter was sent. And the other offices are important because there are two other initiatives at EPA which really promote co-digestion. The Office of Science and Technology is the office leading what's called a grand challenge with the Department of Energy. And that grand challenge is intended to double renewable resources at wastewater plants by 2030. And that includes the production of biogas and maximize co-digestion. And then the Office of Land and Environmental Management is leading an initiative called Winning with Food Waste, which is intended to divert food waste away from landfills and into co-digestion and treatment plants. Both initiatives, we think, lend themselves well to the California legislation and the fact that we ought to be rewarded and not penalized for doing co-digestion and producing a transportation fuel from it. But that, as I say, was unsuccessful. We met again in February of this year before the pandemic hit, excuse me, to advocate for what we called a Plan B. And that was really to determine a baseline biogas production from our sludge only digestion. Excuse me. And we had recommended a baseline of 15 standard cubic feet of biogas produced per pound of volatile solids destroyed. And that we would assign that volume a D3, and then we would assume all other biogas that we were producing was a product of that co-digestion and give it the devalued RIN of D5. That we seen that was a pragmatic way to allocate the different productions of biogas. However, that also was rejected. The person that was in charge of this program at EPA has since moved on to a different position. And so once she is replaced, we will re-engage with the new staff and try to re-energize these discussions. In California, the Air Resources Board revised their low carbon fuel standard regulations in 2018, but they remain committed to having the wastewater sector engaged. And these low carbon fuel standard regulations are the ones that are requiring the 20% reduction in carbon intensity in our transportation fuel by 2030. They have worked with CASA and our members to understand how their new simplified calculator works. And they have a simplified calculator for sludge only digestion and another one for food waste digestion. And they've committed to developing guidance so that we can integrate those two and get full maximum value for the co-digestion and realize the benefit of diverting from a landfill. So the Air Board is very cognizant of the benefits. Another issue that had to be overcome dealt with pipeline injection of our biogas. Cal OSHA has regulations on this, and these regulations apply to states who are delegated from OSHA for this program. I think there are 25 states who are delegated and 25 who are not. OSHA requirements themselves do not apply to municipal government. However, if a state is delegated, then one of the requirements of that delegation is that the state has to impose the requirements on municipal governments as well. And California is a delegated state. I'm not sure where New England states lie in that. But this is called the Process Safety Management Rule, and it really addresses worker safety. And wastewater plants are exempt at this point if they utilize, combust, or sell all of their biogas on site. There was a concern, however, that we might lose that exemption when we move biogas across the fence line if we were holding more than 10,000 pounds of biogas at any one time. However, we were able to meet with Cal OSHA at Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts in February of this year, and we received confirmation that was really positive. They confirmed that our exemption holds as long as less than 10,000 pounds of biogas is held in the system for injection at any one time. So unless you're injecting all of your biogas, which in California, Sacramento Regional Sanitation District does, but they're the exception. If you're not injecting all of it, then you likely will be exempt from these regulations. The exemption also holds if you hold more than 10, if more than 50% of the volume of biogas is sold on the retail market. Next. And I just want to finish up with a slide on the Office of Inspector General report on biosolids that was released in November of 2018. We felt this was a very biased and sensational indictment of the EPA Biosolids Land Application Program. It implied that land application was unsafe until a comprehensive risk assessment was conducted on some 352 constituents that they did not name. But we immediately commented on the report, and then we also began working with researchers at the University of Arizona, Ohio State, Purdue, San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, and others to rebut the report conclusions. We got some funding in conjunction with NACWA, WEF, NEBRA, Northwest Biosolids, and CASA, where we funded a research assistant at Ohio State. And the report was released on July 24th by the USDA W4170 committee. Its main authors were Nick Bosta at Ohio State, Ian Pepper at the University of Arizona, Linda Lee at Purdue University, and myself. And we submitted it to the Office of Inspector General, asked them to post it on their website and engage in discussion with us. We got a response on August 10th, declining to do either. It was a rather curt response. With that, though, I'm happy to answer any questions folks may have on any of this. Sorry for a long-winded presentation there.
No, thank you very much, Greg. There was one question early on, and my friend Ned's helping me monitor it, but it had to do with your neighboring states, Arizona in particular. Let me see if I can find that. And the impact on the California programs, possibly on neighboring states. Can you, let me just see if I can find the exact question.
So the question is how our efforts impact Arizona?
Yeah.
Well, about 13% of our biosolids are currently land applied in Arizona. We expect, it could be that number decreases because as California opens up for land application and distances are not, right now, the reason for that is because of those local ordinances. They have to hopscotch over our own counties to get into Arizona. If our own counties are open, then it's likely that we could find more local uses and farmers that can take advantage of the biosolids. That's the main difference. If you are landfilling in another state, and there is some landfilling both in Oregon and Nevada and Arizona, that will still be considered as landfill disposal and count against the diversion requirements.
Yeah, sort of. I think you already answered this question, but sort of related is how much you were diverting to other states, and I think you answered
yeah,
that.
the only, as I say, it's a small amount going to landfill in Oregon. About 13% goes for land application in Arizona. We have some composting done in Nevada. South Lake Tahoe Public Utilities District brings their biosolids to Nevada, where they are composted and land applied.
Okay. Here's a question, Greg. Do you see any extension of the 1383 implementation deadlines due to COVID or?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a question which has come up. In my discussions with Cal Recycle, I've gotten no indication that they intend to delay any of the implementation requirements. We will see when the regulations become adopted later this year. But I've not heard any movement in that direction by Cal Recycle. That may wind up being a legislative. I know that there have been some requests, I believe, to the legislatures and perhaps the governor's office, but we have not heard anything to that effect yet.
Okay, thanks for that update. Another question was how, if at all, does the Climate Action Reserve effort for soil enrichment protocol play into this?
The Climate Action Reserve actually has a second version of the soil enrichment protocol out for public comment right now. They too are holding a webinar on August 25th. We commented on their first iteration and noticed the lack of biosolids. They were not referenced at all in the protocol. We had a tremendous conversation with them, and they agreed that that was an oversight and intended to include biosolids and now do so. So we think, the Climate Action Reserve protocol plays right into our Healthy Soils Initiative, and we think it is now recognized as the benefit that it is. There are some other aspects of the protocol which are still somewhat difficult that we are still working through. But in general, we're very pleased with the recognition of biosolids and their responsiveness.
Yeah, it sounds like some great synergy there. So I have another question from the audience. And what if you're not successful for the D3 and D5 issue? Do you have a plan B?
Well, we will continue with both of our arguments, which, we'll go back to plan A, where we think that all the biogas produced ought to be a D3. And failing that, we will argue that at least we should be able to develop the baseline and consider the sludge-produced biogas as D3. All else is D5. Both of those fail. I don't know. We're quite limited then in what our options are. Then what happens is the value would be a D5, which, as I say, is generally 10 to 25% the value. The low carbon fuel standard in California is still attractive, and that is being made more so by the co-digestion. So, and I've talked to the Air Board about this, and we're trying to figure out whether or not, at what point the value of the low carbon fuel standard credit could override the devaluation of it at EPA. And we think there may be a point that we can reach.
Okay.
But our options are limited if we're unsuccessful with EPA. There's not a lot of recall.
Yeah. All right. We got a couple more questions here. Do you anticipate any issues with the diversion accounting procedures to comply with 1383? And how long do you think that would take to resolve, if so?
Well, that's a good question. Cal Recycle adopted regulations a couple of years ago for reporting purposes in response to AB 901. And this reporting tool is now in effect and has been for a couple of years, where organic waste is now tracked in terms of its generation and movement across the state to its end use. So that is really the tracking mechanism through which diversion will be determined. I don't know. It's too early for me to really speculate as to what issues may surface from that. One thing that it's important to note is that the number the 25% that's allowed at a landfill is a static number. That's a number based on what was landfilled in 2014. So even as more organic waste is generated in the state, as population increases, we're still limited to that 25% of what was landfilled in 2014. So the amount that needs to be diverted is going to increase every year. Tracking of that may prove to be an issue. I don't know yet. As I say, it's too early to speculate.
Okay, I have one more question for you, Greg, here. With the RIN classification request denied, have you heard from any agencies that's resulted in not being, a financially viable option?
Yeah, I think that there have been some transportation fuel projects that have, if not been stalled, at least have certainly been re-examined because of that. As I say, in California, where we have the low carbon fuel standard, we do have some projects that are moving forward regardless of what EPA is doing. But it's certainly, I'm not sure that I know of anyone who has actually stopped the project, but it is something certainly under consideration.
All right. Well, with that, Greg, we are at 12:59. I would like to thank you very much for your leadership and for this presentation today. And it was very informative. Many thanks again, Greg. And we are open to any suggestions for future topics for our Lunch and Learn, so feel free to email us. We will send out a link to this recording and a copy of Greg's slides for you early next week. So thanks again for joining us on your lunch hour or eating your breakfast in California, and have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you for attending.
Thanks very much, everyone, and thank you, Janine, very much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Greg.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.